Hello everyone. This YouTube video is designed to provide students with support that have chosen to read When America Became a Democracy by Van Newkirk II. It was an article written in the March 2021 issue in The Atlantic. It's a very interesting article about the Voting Rights Act, and it's, as the author argues in the piece, the sort of jeopardy the Voting Rights Act faces, and as the author argues, the potential negative implications for American democracy. So I wanted to start off by saying that I think that, this article is obviously very advanced. That's why I'm creating a support video, but I think you guys are more than capable to tackle these types of readings and be successful at them. And I encourage you to take that risk and take that challenge, right? We don't want to be challenged intellectually, in college, because by that time it's too late. We want to be challenged intellectually as much as possible in high school. So I encourage you to please read the totality of this article. And so that gets at my next point. I'm only going to require you to answer 8 out of the 14 or 15 guided questions. I still need to finalize the list that I've come up with. But I want you to still read the whole article. So if you have no intention of reading the whole article, of trying to abstract out the author's argument, or to think about how the author builds their sophisticated and complex argument, the sort of stylistic elements the author includes, but also like the AP government concepts as well that the author references. If you're not really, trying to think about those things, then I encourage you not to do this assignment. All right, this assignment is for people that want to be challenged intellectually right now, right? Maybe for every reason you want to be challenged intellectually right now. Maybe you want to be challenged intellectually later. That's also okay. I have some ACT vocabulary words that I wrote down. Obviously, when I'm reading an article like this and thinking about assigning an article, you can see my hard work and annotations. Hashtag teacher appreciation. No, I'm kidding. All right. I do it because I love the job. I really do. And also, it's fun, right? It's so cool to teach kids about voting rights. It genuinely is. Like, if you think I'm being sarcastic, I'm not. This is my dream job. And I'm not being sarcastic. But anyways, I went and circled some ACT vocabulary words that I think some of you might have trouble with. I'm going to go ahead and list them in the description of this YouTube video and provide you with definitions of those. Obviously, there's going to be some more that you might have trouble with, but these are some ones that I think are quite, difficult, like acceding, oligarchs, dilute, precariousness in perpetuity, proto-democracy, edifice, antipathy, nebulous, disparate, blatant, innuendo, innocuous, sparseness, preclude, overtly, technocratic, and gaslight. I'm just defining them for you in the description of this YouTube video for your convenience. If you don't like the definitions that I provide you, then by all means, look up the words yourselves. I want to encourage you, however, to start, when you're reading a piece, if you don't get intimidated by one word that you're unfamiliar with. Try to break it down in its constituent parts. See if there's prefixes and suffixes that might give you clues. See if you can break down the root of the word, or if the root of the word is similar to a word that you've encountered before. And use context clues, right? Try to find meaning, the meaning of the word without necessarily looking it up right away, or without just discarding the whole sentence and saying, well, I don't understand that word, so I'm not going to understand that sentence, right? Be comfortable with struggling. And that's, I think, one of the things that a lot of idea kids just aren't for some reason. I don't know why. But you guys are very, very smart. Be comfortable with struggling. Some stylistic points that I wanted to make about this piece. So the piece is interesting, right? So the thesis of this piece, right, isn't going to be written in the first sentence, right? Like some of the early essays that we write for my class, right? The thesis is up front, right? It's an argument that you kind of have to abstract out from reading the whole piece, right? And to do a lot of thinking about, like, what is the argument? What is the author arguing, right? Um, um, that's something that you'll have to think about, um, um, quite hard about. But the heading or the title and the subheadings give us clues, right? It says when America became a democracy, and then the subheading continues: the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally delivered on the stated ideals of this country. Now it hangs by a thread. Oof, mysterious, right? Also, there's a variety of different, like, the piece is divided into sections. All right, so we can see Roman numeral 1, I think Roman numeral 2. There's pictures as well. How are the pictures designed to help convey the author's message? Think about those things. 2 is democracy in the crosshairs. But the first section starts off, and the piece starts off with a letter that the author writes to his mother, his deceased mother, that you'll find out she's deceased later on in the piece. Oops, spoiler alert. But it's interesting. It's incredibly interesting. Think about, why would the author try to start a piece that is going to be about the Voting Rights Act and Supreme Court interpretations of the Voting Rights Act and recent legislation that has been presented to Congress with attempts to try to expand voting rights, recent efforts by states, in the author's view, to curtail the voting rights of historically repressed groups. How does starting a letter to one's mother, a mother that grew up was born in July 9th, 1964, just a year before the Voting Rights Act, why is that significant, right? How does that help convey the author's message? Right, think about those things. I also want to encourage you to think about how the author uses time, right? The author doesn't proceed in a linear order. He talks about, he goes back and forth through time, right? He talks about, significant events in the civil rights movement. He tells detailed stories about specific civil rights activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance. And then he goes to, recent Supreme Court interpretations of the Voting Rights Act. And then he, goes to, towards the end of the piece, he talks to a Columbia University historian that was an expert on Black Power. And he talks to that historian about recent legislation presented in Congress to expand voting rights, right? How does going back and forth through time help the author convey his message? And then I also want to just draw your attention to the tension words, what I call tension words, the but, however, and all those. Those words are so important for writers, especially writers that are making complicated and sophisticated arguments, that are trying to dismiss rebuttals of their arguments. But, however, and although helps generate tension in pieces, right? They also allow authors to make potentially a concession and to dismiss that concession, or to present an alternative view and to eventually dismiss that alternative view. Exactly what we're learning to do in some of our AP government essays. The author of this piece uses but a lot. And so that should be a signal to you that the author is making a very complicated, a nuanced point. And you should be very attentive. Even reread if you have to, right? Don't be afraid to reread if you have to. Finally, some AP government concepts that I wanted to clarify before I close out this video, because it's already a bit too long. Jim Crow, we've talked about it, but just a reminder, it refers to racial segregation and discrimination enforced by laws predominantly in the South, right? So we're talking about segregation laws, discriminatory laws, all that sort of thing. Gerrymandering, we've talked about gerrymandering in AP government before. It's the manipulation of boundaries of electoral districts, boundaries to give one party or group of people an advantage, right? The drawing of electoral boundaries. Pre-clearance, we've talked about that before. There is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Is it Section 5? the Voting Rights Act originally required, or the Voting Rights Act required states with a history of discriminatory voting laws after it was passed in 1965 to go to the Justice Department, to go to or a federal court to seek pre-clearance or approval before they could change their voting laws if they wanted to change them again. It became a very effective mechanism to limit, you know, to eliminate voter suppression in the South. In 2013, Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act was a specific formula that was used to determine which states would have to pre-clear their election changes with the federal government, and they were predominantly southern states. And Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was the actual, policy, right, that required pre-clearance. 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder, which you'll read in the piece, the Supreme Court said that Section 4B's formula was unconstitutional, which is interesting. And then you can read Justice Ginsburg's dissent regarding that decision, where she likens that to throwing out pre-clearance. She likens to this is the exact quote: "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." Right. So that was a famous dissenting analogy that really kind of helped Justice Ginsburg gain fame. The Justice Department is obviously the law enforcement agency, a federal law enforcement agency. It's plays a very important role in this piece. The Justice Department also represents the federal government in court as well. We've talked about these sort of things in the bureaucracy topics. Voter purges. It talks about voter purges very, kind of offhandedly. It assumes that you know what they are. We haven't covered them, but they are often, according to the Brennan Center on Justice out of NYU Law School, they define it as often flawed process of cleaning up voter rolls by deleting names, right? So where voter purges become controversial, right? Obviously, it makes sense to delete names of voters that are deceased, or maybe voters that are no longer eligible to vote. But sometimes they're done almost deliberately incompetently, or sometimes they're done in ways where it seems like the desired outcome is to eliminate people's names off, voter rolls, and to essentially deny them the ability to actually vote because they're not aware that they have been taken off the voter roll, right? So there's an article about voter purges in Georgia that I can link to in the gubernatorial election where Brian Kemp ran against Stacey Abrams. The White Citizens Council, it talks about the White Citizens Council. It's just this white supremacist group in the South. They were kind of a white supremacist group that was it was nicknamed kind of like an uptown clan, right? It attracted more middle class and upper class white supremacists in the South. They claim to shun kind of like the violence of the Klan, but of course the White Citizens Council and many members, did engage in violent terroristic tactics. Then it talks about, recent efforts by President Trump, or former President Trump, I should say, and sort of his allies to overturn the election results of the 2020 presidential election. It cites 18 Republican state attorneys general's efforts to kind of sign on to a lawsuit by a Texas state attorney general seeking to, overturn the presidential election results, essentially frivolous lawsuits. It talks at length about, these recent events and kind of tries to show or makes the argument that the, baseless claims about voter fraud that we've heard oftentimes or we heard a lot about in 2020 and we still hear a lot about in 2021 are, essentially have become, smoke screens to, or, kind of the rationale to engage in voter suppression efforts. And then it doesn't reference Brnovich versus DNC, which was a recent Supreme Court ruling. However, it does talks about, because it does talk about the case that was presented before the Supreme Court, whether Arizona's election laws violated the Voting Rights Act or not. The Supreme Court, much more conservative Supreme Court, rules in Brnovich versus DNC, which is a recent ruling which happened after this piece, but rules that, in fact, that Arizona's election laws, which you can read more about, which, eliminated ballot harvesting and out of precinct voting, or had consequences for out of precinct voting. The consequence being that your vote wouldn't count in federal or in all elections. It says that those laws are not violative of the Voting Rights Act. So it was a very controversial decision. You can read about sort of the dissent and the majority opinion in this great piece of reporting by Adam Liptak out of the New York Times. Adam Liptak out of the New York Times is educated, Yale Law educated, was a great Supreme Court reporter, in my view. You can read the, sort of the highlights of the majority and dissenting opinion in Brnovich versus DNC and kind of understand the implications of Brnovich versus DNC. And I'll include the link in the description. Okay, I hope this is a helpful video.